Every child's first memory of Cape Cod is the road leading up to the bridge, the big silver arch that crosses the canal. Whether it is the Sagamore or the Bourne Bridge, when the family reaches the top of the bridge and everyone can see that sliver of water below them, the big ships and small boats passing underneath, they know that they have crossed over into something special. The canal is the castle moat. It separates work, school, duty, and responsibility from sand, water, rest, and fun. The canal defines the Cape. It separates the Cape from the mainland. The canal, however, was not always there. Before the canal, the Cape was much more isolated, much more remote. Early Cape Codders lived along the shore. People settled near safe harbors. They made their living from the sea. It was a harsh life. Cape Cod sailors grew up on the meanest piece of land on the east coast. The ghosts of many men looked down on the canal with envy.
In the days of sailing ships, when they were at the mercy of the wind, and in particular if they were caught by a northeast storm and they were sailing along the backside of the Cape, some of them would get washed towards the shore. They couldn't tack and claw their way out, and what would happen is they would hit the outer bar, and this generally would tear the bottom out of the vessel. There were a great number of shipwrecks. On average, you had a shipwreck about every 2 weeks on Cape Cod, and a great number of lives were lost. This situation is a thing that encouraged people to think about the Cape Cod Canal.
The trip around the Cape was so treacherous, the solution so easy. 3,000 men can tell you how important the canal is. Boston and New York were the two busiest ports on the East Coast. Right between them was Cape Cod. Boats from the south, loaded with cotton and coal, would pass boats from the north, laden with lumber and ice. They all had to round the Cape.
Cape Cod was notorious for shipwrecks. 3,000 to 4,000 ships have wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod. And many people at first glance of that statistic think that that's a lot of shipwrecks. But when you look at the factors involved in the shipwrecks, you understand and appreciate that probably there should have been a lot more shipwrecks. As early as the 17th century, Cape Cod was marked on the chart as being treacherous.
And it's treacherous because the water can shoal very rapidly. Where there was deep water a week before, there may now be shallow water. And so it's very difficult, for instance, to make navigation charts and keep them up to date because of the rate at which the bottom is changing.
So we know that Cape Cod was dangerous because it was the continent's busiest shipping channel. Approximately 15,000 vessels passed the arm of the Cape per year in the late 19th century. So that tremendous volume of shipping, combined with the primitive ships that were out here by 20th century standards. And then you have Cape Cod itself, which is kind of a mystical blend of navigational hazards, fog, powerful northeast storms, heavy surf, shifting sandbars, underwater sand shoals, strong tides and currents.
The combination of all these factors turned the shoals off Cape Cod into a graveyard for ships. Over 3,000 ships would not make it around the Cape.
Nauset Beach, which stretches along the whole coast of Orleans and Eastham, holds in its fatal sands skeletons of vessels from half the seaports in the world. Henry Kitteridge.
I've read many accounts in the Life-Saving Service reports about skippers who waited until the last minute to tack and didn't have enough freeboard to get around and ended up aground. And then once you ran aground, on one of those big, heavily laden schooners, it usually broke the back of the schooner because the cargo was so much heavier than the vessel itself. There's a triangle right off Cape Cod. If you get caught in that triangle in a northeast wind, sometimes you could beat off, most of the times you couldn't, and you ended up on the beach. That's why I say the skippers used to run their easting down and try to get 50 or more miles east of Cape Cod when going around.
Obviously, the list of shipwrecks is too long to go completely through, but there are some notorious famous shipwrecks that kind of are milestones in Cape Cod's shipwreck problem. The Sparrowhawk was the first recorded shipwreck off of Cape Cod, 1626.
The Sparrowhawk was bringing new colonists from England to Virginia when she was wrecked off of Nauset Beach. Two natives took a message from the survivors to the only other whites they knew, the Pilgrims at Plymouth. The Pilgrims themselves had settled in Plymouth after a brief stop in Provincetown and a close call with the shoals off the Cape.
Jump ahead nearly 100 years and you have the wreck of a pirate ship off of Cape Cod, off of present-day Wellfleet, a ship called the Widow. And the Widow went aground about 200 yards offshore in a horrific storm.
The Widow was a pirate ship. She was on her way north from a very profitable winter in the Caribbean. The crew wanted to try their luck in the Far East. The ships working the China trade were filled with valuable cargo, and the pirates on the Widow were eager to take it. Their captain, Sam Bellamy, better known as Black Bellamy, wanted to make a stop along the way. Black Bellamy was in love with a Cape Cod girl.
The legend goes that Bellamy arrived on the Cape. This is prior to him, his piracy of the Widow. But he arrived on the Cape and was here for a few months. And he met and fell in love with, and she fell in love with him, Goody Hallett of Eastham. Now, Goody was a young girl, easily convinced, and when Bellamy left the Cape, he promised Goody he would return. And then shortly after he left, Goody discovered that she was with child. And of course, in those days, if you were with child and you weren't married, why, you were banished from the community because this was the greatest sin on earth. And but the child was stillborn, and Goody was exiled to the dunes, and she lived in an old shack on the dunes, and she used to walk up and down the dunes at night screaming invectives at Bellamy. But more interesting is if you go down to the beach at night these days, and during a dark and stormy night, you can still hear Goody screaming invectives from the top of the dunes if you listen closely enough. Because most people think it's the wind coming around the dunes, but I think it's Goody Hallett.
Goody Hallett was just one of the many stories sailors told each other about Cape Cod. The sailors also said there were mooncussers on the Cape. The mooncussers were sort of pirates without a boat. It said that the mooncussers would light a lamp on a dark and deserted stretch of beach, hoping to lure a ship to its doom. The mooncussers would wait on the beach for the ship to crash on the shoals, and then, after the crew had drowned, they would row out and strip the ship.
Don't go ashore on the backside of Cape Cod, for there's a woman waiting on the beach with a brick in her stocking. Old sailors saying.
Mooncussers may have been an invention of an overly imaginative sailor, or maybe they never got caught, because there is no record of anyone luring ships to their doom. There is, however, plenty of evidence to suggest that Cape Codders were smart enough to make a profit if a ship was unfortunate enough to wreck on the shores.
Collins, the keeper, told us he found obstinate resistance on Cape Cod to the project of building a lighthouse on this coast, for it would injure the wrecking business. Ralph Waldo Emerson.
They called it wrecking, and sometimes shipping companies would pay them to recover the cargo. And sometimes, by the time the owners learned of their loss, it would be hidden in the barns of Cape Cod. Either way, a good Cape Cod man always kept an eye on the sea. That doesn't mean Cape Codders were hoping for shipwrecks. A wreck was usually a sad occasion. There was, however, one wreck that patriot Cape Codders enjoyed. It was a British ship during the Revolutionary War, the Somerset.
One of the most famous shipwrecks, and oddly one of the unusual shipwrecks on the Cape, was a military vessel. We didn't have a lot of shipwrecks that were military vessels, nor did we have a lot of passenger ferries that were shipwrecks. Most of the shipwrecks were the freighters, the barges, the 3, 4, or 5-masted schooners.
The Somerset had blockaded the entrance to Boston Harbor at the beginning of the Revolutionary War.
The Somerset's crew, during the storm, during the shipwreck, many perished. The Somerset itself, when the storm broke, was burned to the waterline by the local patriots.
One of the most tragic wrecks was the Portland.
The Portland was a passenger steamship carrying passengers from Boston to Portland, Maine. Got caught in the storm due to the fact that the weather reports were slow in coming in.
The Portland left Boston bound for Portland, Maine, just ahead of the storm. The storm pushed her back past Gloucester, past Boston, and to the outer reaches of Cape Cod.
And the Portland eventually broke apart off of the shores of Cape Cod. The wreckage and human remains washed ashore on the Cape, although the shipwreck occurred many miles out to sea.
These 4 wrecks, the Sparrowhawk, the Widder, the Somerset, and the Portland, are 4 that stand out from thousands more. The fact is, ships had to sail around the Cape, and not all of them would make it.
There's an inevitability that you couldn't prevent shipwrecks, but then the focus was on just helping shipwreck victims get off the shipwrecks and back to shore. The early efforts at saving shipwreck victims or assisting them came with the Massachusetts Humane Society in the 1780s. It was a private organization recognizing the need to help shipwreck victims once they came ashore. There were a series of huts that were built along the Massachusetts shoreline. They had wood stoves or coal stoves and food supplies. And the theory was that the mariners, if they made it to shore at that point, the huts would serve as a way to keep them alive. The life-saving service and the life-saving stations were built and manned beginning in the 1870s and had a long history of saving people off of shipwrecks. We're in the Old Harbor Life Saving Station, which was one of 13 stations built on Cape Cod. And we knew that this station was one of the last to be built on the Cape. The attempt of the builders of the life-saving stations was to have a station every 5 miles on the outer beach. There were 2 types of rescue in the early life-saving service, both of which by 20th century standards are pretty primitive. 90% of the rescues were attempted with a surf boat. The other 10% of the time, a line was fired to the ship in distress with hopes that the crew was still alive and could rig lines to their mast and then one at a time come back to shore in a cork life ring with canvas pants. The Old Harbor Station responded to many shipwrecks. It rescued over 200 ships and rescued over 300 victims. I think it's interesting to note the kind of the feeling of inevitability about shipwrecks and that they were going to happen. So the focus was on the efforts of saving and comforting the victims.
The annals of this voracious beach. Who could write them unless it was a shipwrecked sailor? How many have seen it only in the midst of danger and distress, the last strip of earth which their mortal eyes behold? Henry David Thoreau.
Although it was little comfort to the victims, there was a way to avoid sailing around the Cape. The natives had shown it to the Pilgrims. Unfortunately, it involved going up a river and portaging across to another river, something a cargo ship could not do. But it was another way, a place, a perfect spot to cross Cape Cod.
The interesting thing to me about the canal is it was, in large part, the site of the canal was prepared by the last glacier, in that there were two valleys, one that drained towards Cape Cod Bay and one that drained towards Buzzards Bay. So the valley that the canal is running in was there and was the obvious place to put a canal. There were other potential routes for the canal. There was talk about using Jeremy's gutter. The thing about that is it didn't help because you went right out. You still, if you're going south down the coast or coming north up the coast, you still had to pass Nantucket Shoals. So that was never seriously taken. Another place, and again, another outlet for Glacial Lake Cape Cod, was essentially the Bass River Valley, which cuts across the Cape from in Dennis. And that would, of course, done all right. It would have gotten you in from Cape Cod Bay into Nantucket Sound. And that way you go out Vineyard Sound and you would have been able to avoid the shoals at Nantucket. But again, that was never seriously considered. The valleys of the Monument and Scusset Rivers, where the canal is today, were by far the most inviting site for the canal.
A canal across Cape Cod seemed to be a logical thing because the Indians around Sagamore and so forth, they had shown the Pilgrims that if there was a place between Scusset River on the Cape Cod Bay side and Monument River on the Buzzards Bay side, that where they used to portage their boats between one bay and another.
The Pilgrims at Plymouth needed access to the south. They were in debt to the corporation in England that had financed their move to the New World. While they did trade with the local Indians, trading with the Dutch who had settled in Manhattan would be much more profitable.
Well, around 1626-27, rather than try to continually try to go around the Cape, which they usually didn't do at all with their small shallops, they had several small shallops, workboats, such as the one anchored by the Mayflower. They said the thing to do would be to go up Scusset Creek, make the 4 or 5 mile portage of goods in carts or maybe on people's backs to the Monument River, and then they could take a shallop and go out into Buzzards Bay. And to save the trouble of carting everything all the time, they built a little trading post at Aptuxet.
Aptuxet could be considered America's first store. The trading post was a meeting place for the Dutch, Pilgrims, and Indians. For the Pilgrims, it was an open door to the south. It was here that America's first currency was used. Polished bits of clamshells, known as wampum, had an established value. At the trading post, goods could be traded for goods or goods for wampum. For the Pilgrims, Aptuxet was convenient, and it was safe.
Once they were at Aptuxet, they could put their boats in and reach any place they wanted to the south. Their real enemies were pirates. We do know that pirates captured 2 of their ships on the high seas. French captured 1, Turks captured another. Here they were safe because they were up the river, out of sight of Buzzards Bay, and yet ocean-going boats could come up that river, but only on a high tide. That wouldn't stop the Pilgrims, but it would tend to make a pirate think twice about getting stuck up a river waiting for the next high tide.
So of all these varied ideas to cross Cape Cod with a canal, the best one was still the original one, and that is across what I call the Isthmus of Cape Cod, from Sandwich to Buzzards Bay. It seemed as if nature intended that a canal be built there.
Nature may have intended for a canal to be built there, but it took man a long time to do it. Most of the early plans never got past the study stage. There is no written proof, but allegedly Miles Standish was the first to suggest linking the Scusset and Manomet rivers by means of a man-made ditch. During the Revolutionary War, the British blockaded Provincetown, virtually cutting off the round-the-Cape route. General George Washington became convinced that a canal would benefit the national defense, but nothing would come of it. For the next 90 years, there would be survey after survey.
There were many false starts, and there were also a lot of frauds and phonies. You didn't have to wait too long if you got a weekly newspaper before there was another Cape Cod Canal story, another plan, another group.
Everyone agreed that a canal could be built. The problem was no one wanted to pay for it. By the late 1860s, it was clear that the only way the canal would be built would be privately.
So the state of Massachusetts says, okay, we'll give you a charter to build a Cape Cod Canal. And the charters were traditionally 5 years in length.
The charter allowed the private company to issue bonds. It set requirements that the company had to meet as far as depth, width, and bridges over the canal. It also gave Massachusetts the right to take back the charter if no progress was made. This made for some pretty feeble attempts.
One of the worst efforts was the one in 1880. They brought in 400 of these Italian immigrants, none of whom could speak English. They brought them in from New York by train, and these men were given little wooden wheelbarrows and small shovels, and they were supposed to be digging and filling up, these 400 guys, and digging and filling up these wheelbarrows and then wheeling this dirt out. Now, at that rate, with those little wooden wheelbarrows, the canal would still not be finished, I don't think, even today. Well, when they weren't paid and they weren't fed, and they'd been promised both, they became not unruly at all, but they did become frustrated and hungry. And so they went around trying to get sandwich people to give them work that they could do in the yard or anything at all in exchange for a meal. One of the quotes around sandwiches that the Italians were very well behaved, more than the locals.
The first serious attempt to move some earth was made by F.A. Lockwood.
Lockwood was a manufacturer in East Boston of hoisting machinery and all sorts of equipment like that. And he built one of those machines, and it came to Sandwich in 1884 and dug for 2 or 3 years, and it actually made a canal about 7,000 feet long, which was certainly a lot bigger than anybody else had built. And finally that company ran out of money after a few years, and the Lockwood dredge finally was abandoned. And two things about the Lockwood dredge. One of the great inventions of the 1890s were street lights. So they went to the people who owned the Lockwood dredge, what was left of it. And dredges, of course, had lights on them so they could work 24 hours a day. And the town of Sandwich bought the steam compressor that made generator that made electricity, and all those big lights, and they strung them along Main Street. And it became a very popular thing, people talking around the Cape that they actually have street lights, so you can see at night in Sandwich. The second thing about the Lockwood dredge is that it had an ignominious end, which it probably didn't deserve because it's important to the history of the canal, and that is that the people in town went down and set fire to it, what was left of the Lockwood dredge. That was the bonfire for 1/4 of July, and people in town thought it was pretty terrible what was happening, what the children were doing, but I think some of those children might have been 40 or 50.
Finally, in 1898, Massachusetts granted a charter to the Boston, Cape Cod, and New York Canal Company. A man named DeWitt Clinton Flanagan led the company, only to have his financing fall through at the last moment. It looked like another failure until Flanagan met the man who would build the Cape Cod Canal, August Belmont.
Eventually it was built, and it was built in this century, started in 1909 by a private banker by the name of August Belmont.
August Belmont was rich. Among his many accomplishments, he founded the American Kennel Club, defended the America's Cup twice, and built Belmont Park. He was one of the top financiers of his day.
Belmont was the prime mover, and Flanagan had the charter from 1899, and then he and about 1905, 1906, he and Belmont were seriously involved in plans to build the Cape Cod Canal.
Belmont had also built the 4th Avenue subway in New York. He was not afraid to tackle a big project, and he insisted that he would do it without any government help.
The Cape Cod Canal has been built by businessmen as a commercial proposition. We wish and have asked for no government help. August Belmont.
They figured that the canal would be built, by most estimates from engineers, in about 3 years.
Belmont would bring along many people who had worked for him on the New York subway.
The people who built the canal, who were all friends of Belmont, had dredges, and they figured the best thing to do was to start on one end of the canal and the other, and then dredge toward each other and eventually dig out that waterway. Well, that's an awful slow way because you have two headings.
Construction began in 1909. The dredging operation did start at both the east and west ends. In addition to the dredging, the construction team had to do several things. They had to dredge a channel leading from the west end of the canal outward. They had to build a breakwater and a sand catcher to protect the exposed eastern mouth of the canal from storms. They started by dropping huge chunks of Cape Ann granite until it rose above the waterline in a pyramid-type design. After 3 years, the breakwater would finally be completed and consist of over 340,000 tons of granite. They had to move a railroad track that ran down the center of the isthmus, and they had to build 3 bridges that would rise up so ships could pass through the canal, 2 highway bridges, and a railroad bridge. It was an ambitious project. Construction soon fell behind schedule, and there was one problem no one expected.
It was a much more difficult thing to dig than they expected, because in the valley bottom they found huge boulders that they didn't know were there. All their preliminary borings didn't hit any boulders, and then they got in there and they had to blast and move huge boulders. So that made it a lot tougher.
Every time a dredge would hit a boulder, the dredge would have to back up to let the divers set explosives and then move back in after the explosion. As progress fell behind, more dredges were added. There had to be a better way.
William Barclay Parsons, who probably was the most prominent civil engineer of his day, became the chief engineer of the Cape Cod Canal. Parsons, who had been responsible for building railroads in the Mexican system, the Chinese system, and so forth. And he'd been on the Panama Canal Commission. What Parsons did was he said the Panama Canal is going to be a steam shovel job. You're going to dig it's not going to be one dredge in the Pacific Ocean working toward the east and one in the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean working toward the west, because it would take too long to do it. So you dig in the dry with steam shovels. And Parsons said, well, the Cape Cod Canal could also be a steam shovel job, and we could finish it in 3 years. But the contractor said, no, we're buying more dredges and so forth. And they stayed with that for a while. And finally, after 2 years, Parsons convinced them that they should do some dry digging. And eventually, about 1.5 miles of the canal was dug by steam shovels. But it could have, if it had been started that way, would have finished in 3 years.
It took 5 years to build the canal. Cape Cod was now an island, but Cape Codders were still Cape Codders.
There is, I think, a wonderful story about the Cape Cod Canal during construction time. They had to deal with selectmen in the town of Bourne and the town of Sandwich. So the canal company said, as long as we are building this, and maybe into the future, we are going to pay each of you, because we're going to have meetings, and we need you to attend the meetings and so forth and understand our point of view. So we're going to pay you $300 a year. Well, there was one man from Sandwich who was not well, and finally he never was able to get out of bed and attend any of these meetings. But at the end of the year, he always submitted a bill for $300. So they asked this man, who had not attended a meeting in quite some time, over a year, you never attended any of these meetings. Why are you submitting a bill for $300? And he said to them, well, even though I couldn't attend the meetings, I was lying here in bed and I was thinking about the Cape Cod Canal.
The canal, which Miles Standish first proposed, which was talked of in revolutionary times, is at last a realized dream. Lighthouse and lifesaver will no longer be the motif of the Cape's theme, for the days of hurricane and wreck at the outer tip are over, with the short inside route from bay to bay. The Spectator.
Cape Cod finally had its canal. True, it was a narrow canal, and tolls for large ships could run as high as $750. Traffic could go only one way at a time, and it was a treacherous canal. The current was extremely fast, and the bridge abutments were close to the channel. This resulted in several wrecks that would close the canal for weeks at a time. Eventually, many captains began returning to the old round the Cape route, sharply cutting into Belmont's toll revenues. The canal was also very expensive to maintain. It would shoal as sand was brought in with the tide, and it required constant dredging. It quickly began losing money. All of these things made August Belmont rethink that the federal government should get involved with the canal. But the government wasn't interested, not until World War I. A German submarine got close enough to the U.S. coast to fire on a barge going around the Cape. The government immediately took over the canal as a matter of national defense. Belmont was elated. After the war, in 1920, the government wanted to give the canal back, but August Belmont had had enough of the canal business and didn't want it. Eventually, the government agreed to buy the canal, and Belmont agreed to run it until both sides could agree on a price.
I started on the canal in 1927, and the government took it over in 1928. Of course, in those days, you didn't have two-way traffic. I mean, the canal was only 100 foot wide and 24 foot deep. And you'd have to regulate the traffic like that according to the tide. It was quite a job to stem the tide if you were head tide. And in the early days where they had a 4-barge tow come through, our 4-barge tow do at the west end, he'd bring one barge back through the canal, drop it off at Sandwich, he'd hoist up his sail and he'd sail up the bay. They'd go back and get the second one the same way. By the time you got back with the fourth one, the first one was almost into Boston. When I first started, of course, everything was just done by telephone. One ring, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3.5, 4, and Sandwich is ring number 4. We had a follower at Wings Neck at the other end, the west end of the canal, and I was stationed at the east end of the canal. Of course, your duty was to spot these vessels coming down the bay and report them to the dispatcher. And then we had to regulate the traffic lights. You had to run downstairs, put on the traffic lights, or red or whatever traffic they wanted to hold the ships up. The main thing I remember before I went to work there, the New York boat going through. Everybody used to come down, blow the horn, he'd toot the whistle, and everybody go home and listen to Amos and Andy on the radio, because that was the only thing to listen to that days.
The daily boats transiting the canal to and from Boston and New York was a social occasion for many Cape Codders.
First you'd see the searchlight, and he would flash it from one shore to the other, and then they would blow for the Sagamore Bridge to open. I think 3 blows, I'm not sure about the rules of the sea. And it was quite a sight to see it going through, because it was so big when the canal was narrow. It loomed high on the sea, on the water.
In 1928, the federal government finally purchased the canal for $11.4 million. Belmont's losses totaled more than $4 million. Most of the canal workers stayed on as federal employees.
When they had the party for me at the Legion, one of the Corps of Engineers men said that when the government took it over, they got $11 million canal, 2 bridges, and Bill Donovan.
In March of 1928, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was assigned by Congress to operate the canal as a toll-free waterway. That's when the flag that you see flying first went up and the canal became toll-free. It was badly shoaled, and the initial goal was to correct that, so there was immediate dredging. However, the Corps soon realized that there was going to be a need for vast improvements. So the first phase was the construction of 2 fixed high-level bridges, which were completed in 1935. Concurrently, the Corps undertook construction of the vertical lift railroad bridge, which was completed in 1936. The second phase of improvements, which was the widening and deepening of the canal, was undertaken under authority of the River and Harbor Act of 1935. So we went ahead and undertook a rather vast project.
To prevent the decay of the canal sides that had plagued it since its opening, the Corps laid a bed of riprap that extended into the canal. These flat interlocking pieces of granite greatly reduced the erosion from the shifting tides and defined the canal banks. The treacherous western approach channel was also widened and straightened, reducing the need for constant dredging that had plagued Belmont's canal.
The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 was designed to provide jobs for the nation and all the folks who were feeling the hard times of the Depression. And under that act, 4,000 people were employed in construction of the highway bridges and the railroad bridge. If you were unskilled, the pay rate was 50 cents per hour, whereas skilled workers received $1.20 per hour, which for those times seemed to be pretty good wages.
When the government's renovations were complete, the canal had a total length, including approach channels, of 17.4 miles. It had been widened to a bottom width of 480 feet, making the Cape Cod Canal the widest sea-level waterway in the world. The 2 highway bridges have a vertical clearance of 135 feet and a horizontal clearance of 550 feet, easily allowing 2-way traffic through the canal. The railroad bridge has a 136-foot clearance and is a vertical lift design. The 554-foot center span lowers to allow railroad traffic to travel on and off of Cape Cod.
Really interesting, I think, is that they were able to keep vessel traffic moving through this waterway while they were undertaking this phased and massive improvement project.
Only a few years after the renovations were complete, the need for the canal as a vital piece of the nation's defense was once again realized.
Unfortunately, by the late 1930s, war had started in Europe. As the war progressed, we would go down and watch the boats as they would come from Europe. A lot of these ships were in an advanced state of being shot up. Oftentimes you could see holes shot in them. You could see where they had been on fire. I was too young to really realize at that time the importance of the convoys as they were eastbound.
The Navy set up the canal in Buzzards Bay as a staging area for convoys to cross the Atlantic.
What they did was they went down to Cuttyhawk Island and they put anti-submarine nets from there over to New Bedford. And then they had a ship to just open the submarine nets whenever a vessel was coming in. And the ships would come up the coast and they would be assembled in Buzzards Bay. And then the convoys would start. The longest one was about 80 ships. You had small blimps from South Weymouth Naval Air Station overhead looking for submarines. You had Coast Guardsmen with attack dogs, mostly German Shepherds, walking up and down the service highways on both sides of the canal.
To prevent an attack from Cape Cod Bay, the U.S. Army installed an old World War I gun at the eastern entrance.
Over at Sagamore Highlands, they had a big gun mounted there. If any foreign ships come in there, or submarines come in there, they had a crew and disappearing gun.
The New York and Boston boats and ships like them were forced into service by the Navy as a diversion to the main convoys.
They painted them all up gray, and they took off from Nova Scotia as a dummy fleet, and they went one way, and then the fleet went the other way that they were supposed to go.
But unfortunately, in 1942, they were both torpedoed off the Irish coast, and that ended the effective good times of the Boston and the New York.
After the war, the canal continued to grow as a valuable commercial asset to East Coast commerce.
The reason that August Belmont, the commercial reason that he decided to go ahead with this very expensive project of building a Cape Cod Canal was the fact that there was so much coal coming up the coast, and coal was the fuel of those days, in early part of the century and up until World War II. And today, 85% of the fuel that goes through, of the cargo that goes through the canal, is still fuel. Now it's petroleum, of course.
Here at the canal station, our primary mission is search and rescue. However, we maintain a pretty intensive law enforcement program here where we try and get on as many boats as we can in the area to make sure everybody has the required safety equipment. We have 30 people here at the station. We have 5 of us work 8 to 5 every day of the week, and then we have 2 crews of 12 people that work 2 days on and 2 days off. They're here 24 hours a day, around the clock. We have 3 boats, a 41-footer, which is a utility boat, the 44-footer here behind me, which is a surf boat, and we have a fast response 21-foot Ridge-Hull inflatable. It does approximately 40 miles an hour. It's inflatable, so you're really not going to have to worry about hurting somebody else's boat when you come alongside. It's a very forgiving boat. We have a pretty unique relationship with the Army Corps. Due to the length of the canal, which is about 7 miles long, and we're on the eastern end. If we have a search and rescue case on the west end, we have at least a half-hour transit to get down to the west end. So the Army Corps has patrol boats down there. We give them a simple phone call, let them know where the position of the disabled boat is or the search and rescue case, and they're usually there 9 times out of 10 before we are. Also at our station here, we have a large volunteer service, which is Coast Guard Auxiliary. They do commercial safety examinations at the dock as the guy's putting his boat off his trailer, and he'll make sure the guy's got his safety equipment. And they also do boating safety courses for the public. In the canal, due to the current, we have about a 6-knot current in the canal, which means if you lose your power, lose steering in the canal, you're going to be on the rocks very quickly. So we consider that an emergency search and rescue case. We launch our boats, we're underway within less than a minute, most likely. And like I said, we call the Army Corps, so if it's down on the west end, they'll get there first, but we still respond. And that is, we probably get 15 to 20 of those a year in the canal.
When a ship larger than 60 feet travels through the canal, it requires a special captain, called a pilot, that is familiar with the local waters. The pilots are put on the ships on the fly as the ships approach the canal.
My job is to put pilots on ships and take pilots off ship in the Cape Cod Canal, in Cape Cod Bay, and in Buzzards Bay.
Once on board, the pilot contacts Canal Control for clearance.
2-1, Regal Empress at Hog Island 1 and 2.
Regal Empress, 2-1, roger that, Cap. Bring it right along. I have no westbound traffic at this time. The Regal Empress is one of the many cruise ships that come through the canal. Basically, when they call, they ask for clearance through here, which is the Marine Traffic Control Center. He's most concerned with weather conditions and also any traffic in the canal at that time. We monitor and track traffic through the canal with our radars, And also we have a tracking system that enables us to track anything through the canal. We have 5 radar sites here at the canal, each with 2 radars and 2 video cameras. 1 radar is active all the time, 1 radar is on standby. The cameras, 1 points east and 1 points west. Here on my right is the working display, which is much like an air traffic control system, except with boats and water. It's here that I can assign a track to a vessel, get his course and his speed, and with that information, I can direct traffic safely here at the canal. On the big screen is where all the information comes together. As you can see, the curves have been taken out of the canal. The blue represents water, and the light blue areas represent restricted passing zones. The track that you currently see in the canal is the Regal Empress. From this point, I will monitor the Regal Empress's transit until the pilot calls to inform me that he is clear of the canal.
As a ship advances toward the end of the canal, the pilot boat takes the pilot off, again on the fly. The boat approaches the ship from the side, matches her speed, and then pushes against the ship to make a stable platform for the pilot to disembark.
The ladders can run anyway from stepping off my deck onto a ship up to 30 steps on a rope ladder going up the side of the ship. We really don't have much of a problem boarding and taking pilots off ships in the summertime. I really earn my money and they earn theirs in the winter. When people are heading to shore, I'm going out. And when I'm going up and down this canal, I see many different things. Of course, I see all the fishermen fishing from the shores, and I see them catching fish. They have surface roads on both sides of the canal, and I guess they're nice and smooth and even. So there's rollerbladers, and there's bicyclers, and there's families with little children. I always wave or blow my horn to kids. They love that. They think that's just grand. And it's really the canal itself just offers so much for families. And the activities are 24 hours a day during the summer. You'll see people out there at all hours of the night. At one time I got a thrill of these tremendous seas, but now as I get older and a little wiser, I get a little bit scared. But we get a bonus side too. There's times I go out here at night and it's flat out there. It's like a mill pond, and the only ripple out there is from my boat, and it's just as clear and nice. The beauty is just spectacular. But I'll go out here in the East End, especially in the mackerel season, and I might have a pilot with me. I always have two rods, one for the pilot and one for me. And in the early spring, we'll sit out there, we'll do some mackerel fishing, and it breaks up the day. And once in a while, if I get enough time, I'll do a little trolling and snag a bluefish. So we can mix a little bit of business with pleasure.
Humanity demanded a canal at Cape Cod. Commerce needed it. Perseverance, pluck, and financial ability finished it. Commodore J.W. Miller, National Geographic Society.
To order your own or additional copies of the Cape Cod Canal, send $19.95 plus $3 shipping and handling to Sagamore Films, Post Office Box 1242, Sagamore Beach, Massachusetts, 02562. Or you can call 1-508-387-6832.